Hello, 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 my very beautiful and very symmetrical friends. It's your good friend Sam here. Welcome back to class number 2 in our networked art course. Before we get started, a little bit of administration to clear up, a little bit of administrivia to take care of. So, unfortunately, there's some bad news. Too many people have dropped the course for me to stay above the minimum course size at NYU, and so I won't be able to continue this semester to do this course in an official capacity. However, the good news is that NYU's loss, it's your gain. You know, I've got this syllabus here, and my feeling is why let a good syllabus go to waste, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and put all these videos up. Hopefully they'll be helpful to someone. Worst case scenario, they'll be helpful for me next semester. So at least somebody will benefit from them. But enough about that. Let's get down to the meat, the main course, and that is to take the server that we wrote in the last class and actually deploy it. And further, we'll deploy it with a client-side application that will handle our rendering rather than a server-side renderer. So what do I mean by all this? Two important things. First, deploying the server. Last class, we ran our server locally. And what that means usually is that only other machines on the same network, or in some cases, depending on how the network is configured, only the machine that's actually running the server can interact with it. Much more typical is you can configure your machine to be exposed to the outside world and the internet at large. Much more typical is to use some kind of service like Heroku or Amazon to host your site for you, host your server for you using a virtual machine. And that is exposed to the internet, and that's what actually talks to the outside world. So you have a situation where you write your server locally, then you deploy it to a virtual machine, and that's what actually does the interaction. And we'll look at how to do that today. Other thing that we'll talk about is client-side rendering. In the last class, when we got a server request, a request for a page, we were able to serve a dynamic page, a page whose content was different depending on the state, how many times somebody had viewed the page, or in the case of your homework, where, the state of the adventure game was, what items were in the inventory or whatever, would create a different page. But what was actually, the dynamic part of it was done on the server. I'm going to show you in this class how to do that kind of thing in the client using React, which is a front-end technology that combines sort of your application, lets you combine your application logic with some kind of data, and then in the client, in the browser itself, those things get pushed together. This is how Facebook, Twitter, pages that are essentially just apps that show you content, this is how they typically work. Not necessarily by using React specifically, but the majority of the time with client-side rendering. So anyway, let's get started and look at how to do all that. So the first thing that I'm going to do, change to my NYU pip 2021 directory. For last class, we had the node intro directory in this Heroku try. I'm going to make a new directory called, I'll just call it deploy Heroku. And the first thing that we're going to look at is how to deploy to Heroku. So what is Heroku? It's just a service that will run web servers for you. So essentially you get a virtual machine, you can deploy your code there, and that code will run. Heroku will run that code and expose it to the outside world, and you can share essentially pages, servers, access to servers that you've written yourself. And it's free to get started. It does get quite expensive once you get beyond a certain bandwidth and, run time and all this kind of stuff, data storage, this kind of thing, but it's free to start. So we're going to use Heroku for now. So the first thing you need to do if you haven't already is go to Heroku.com and sign up for an account. Apparently I already have an account. You will need to log in to Heroku before you can get started with this class. So go do that now if you haven't already. Are you domiciled in Italy? Italian customers. Okay, I accept. So once you've done that, so let's go ahead and we already made an Express application in our last class, but let's do it again just to get some practice. So remember, first thing we can do, git init, and and this will initialize an empty Git repository, and then we can do npm init to initialize, and I'm just going to accept all the defaults. This makes puts a package JSON in our directory, and also initializes it as a Git repository. So now I can do git add dot to stage all the local files, and then do git commit m initial commit. Cool. So we've got very basic npm package set up. I'm going to do npm install express. Take a sip of coffee. Installation is always a good time for coffee. And then we've got node modules there. I'm going to go ahead and open this up in VS Code now. And add a gitignore file .gitignore. It's probably a little small. There you go. And just type node modules. Not node nodules, node modules. Cool. And then we can do git add dot git commit m added express. Okay, so let's go ahead and write a very simple node server. I'm just going to, instead of calling it server.js, I'll just call it index.js. Doesn't really matter, you can call it whatever you like. And then I'm just going to do typical express stuff. So you remember we have to do something like this. Const express equals require express, and const app equals, so you remember we require express and then create a new application, and then we set up our routes. So we can do app.get the root route, a function, and then so I'm going to start to slowly move towards, there's basically two ways to declare a function in JavaScript. One that you've seen all the time is something like this: function a b, return a plus b. There's another way to declare functions, should be a plus here. There's another way to declare functions that's a bit more, what's wrong with this function? Oh, I have to name the function myfunc, right? Sorry, of course. There's another way to declare functions that's really nice. It's called big arrow. It's called big arrow. I've heard it called big arrow notation for declaring a function. So this is one way to declare a function named myfunc. Another thing you can do is something like this: const my other func equals a b big arrow open braces and then return a minus b. These do almost the same thing. There's some subtle differences. First difference is that, you don't necessarily need to remember all of these right now, but I'll mention them now. The first is that this is hoisted, which just means that you can use this function before you've declared it. So if you do something up here like, const x equals myfunc a b, or I guess a and b need to be declared, so 1 and 2. This will work even though you're using this function here, but you've declared it down here. Function definitions like this are hoisted to the top level, whereas functions like this are not. The other difference is that true? I'm almost sure that's true. The other difference that I know for a fact is true is that big arrow notation captures this, and function definitions like this do not. This isn't so critical now, but it may come up later. For now, just be aware that if you use this inside of a function declared like this, the keyword "this" is what I'm talking about. So if you do like something like this dot prop equals 4 or whatever, the interpretation of the "this" keyword may be different if you declare your function like this versus like this. Those are the two big key differences. Anyway, all this just to say that if you see me using this big arrow notation, know that it's a function definition, and feel free to review online the differences between declaring functions like this and using this big arrow notation to declare a function in JavaScript. But I'm probably going to start using this big arrow notation because it's usually easier to read. And that's why all this, I mentioned all this because I'm about to, in this here, instead of writing function rec res and then declaring the function like this, I'm going to use big arrow notation. So I'll delete the function keyword, and then after the declaration of the function parameters, I'm going to use this big arrow. So fewer keystrokes, not necessarily better, but in this case, it's hopefully pretty readable. So just get used to seeing that and understanding that that means we're declaring a function that takes two arguments, in this case, the request and the response, and then doing something with them. Okay, so all we're going to do is just do res.send and then send something really simple like, wow, amazing, you did it, you have reached this page, you are so great, how did you get to be so great, have you always been this great, or is it a recent thing? Please tell me because I myself would like to be more great and could always use some tips. And we'll leave it off there. But, feel free to write an entire treatise here, regarding greatness or whatever. And then last thing we do, of course, is just do app.listen 3000, or which is the port on which you're listening, and then just do console.log server listening on port 3000. Okay, so this is all territory that we've covered before. You should know what's going on here, but point is that you can now do node index.js. The F? You can now do node index.js, server listening on port 3000. We can do localhost 3000. And look, there it is. It's our web page, our really amazing web page being served to us. Okay, so far what we've done is review the last class. Let's get this thing on Heroku. Two big things that we need to do in order to make this go on Heroku. First thing is to declare or create a proc file. Now, a proc file is a special file that Heroku reads. You can see it's even got the Heroku logo here. VS Code recognizes this as a Heroku file. What this does is it tells the Heroku virtual machine, if you think about when we want to run this server, you know that you have to open the terminal, navigate to the directory, type node server.js. In this proc file, you're essentially telling Heroku how to get started and how to use the code that you've written. So what we can do, hang on one second, I'm just looking at my notes. Interesting. Okay, so what we do here is first you type the name of the process and then what you would like that process to do. In this case, node index.js. This is how Heroku will run our code. It will run node and then the name of the node file to run index. And the process named web is a special process that will have access to the outside world. So this is actually all we need in our proc file because all we're doing is starting one process, a server, or node process rather, that runs the file index.js, which happens to start a web server. Now, the other thing that we need to do is come back into index.js, and right down here, we're using port 3000. So we're listening on port 3000. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that it's not necessarily the case. So Heroku is going to figure out its own port that it actually wants to run on. So it's going to open up a port to the outside world, and we want to connect to that port, but we don't know ahead of time what that port is going to be. Instead, Heroku is going to tell us when it runs this file, and it's going to tell us by passing what's called an environment variable. So what that looks like is something like this. When I run this process by doing node index.js, I'm not setting any environment variables, but I can also do something like myvar equals 42, and then node index.js, and that runs the process again. But there's an environment variable, myvar, that has been set to 42. And in Node, you can inspect those by looking at a special global object that is created when you start or by the time your script is being run, this object has been created for you. That object is called process. So if I do console.log envar and then plus process.env for environment and now this is the object where all of our environment variables are attached. So I can type myvar here, and it will tell us what the value of myvar is. So if I run this again, you can see it right down here, envar42. It's logging the value of the environment variable myvar, which we're pulling out of process.env. So this is the same way that Heroku is going to pass the port that we should be using to us so that we can attach or run our server attached to that port. So I'll do const port equals process.env.port or 3000. And so what this is saying is look at the value at process.env.port. If it's defined, assign it to port. If it's not defined, use the value 3000. And down here, instead of saying listen 3000, we'll say listen port, and then server listening on port plus port. And this is going to be resolved to the value of port, obviously, not to the word port. So if we run this one more time, we should see what we expect. I'm going to go ahead and do this. Server listening on port 3000. Which is that because we haven't passed in a port, but I could also do port equals 8000. And now it says server listening on port 8000. So we're actually totally done getting our project set up to work with Heroku. There is actually one tiny thing that we could do if we wanted to, which is tell Heroku which version of Node we want to use. So if I do Node version, it tells me that I'm running Node version 12.14.1. So Node version 12. You might be running a more recent version of Node. You probably are. If I wanted Heroku to use this version of Node specifically, I could come into my package JSON and add an entry here called engines, and then just say that I would like it to use Node version 12.x, which just means use any version of Node that has the major version 12. This is optional. If you don't include this, Heroku will just use the latest version of Node, which is in this case totally fine. It might matter depending on your project. Okay, so this is everything ready to go. I'm going to do git add dot one more time, and then git commit m ready for Heroku. And now we can enter the Heroku stage of this whole process. So the first thing we need to do is go to Heroku and create an application. You can see I've got a bunch of applications here already from other random projects, but we can just make a new one. I'm going to create a new app. I'm going to call this app something. Let's call it electric pancake. Doesn't matter. It can be whatever you like, as long as it's available, I guess. So now we have an app called Electric Pancake. And what I want to do is get our application onto this application, onto this Heroku application. And the way that you do that is by following this process down here, which basically synchronizes your Heroku with your local Git repository with Heroku's copy of the repository. When we do git push origin main to push our repository back up to GitHub, what we're doing is we are taking our local repository and syncing it with the version of the repository that lives on GitHub. Heroku does the same thing. It also runs Git, has its own local repository, and when we do this follow this workflow, we're pushing our repository to Heroku. So I'm going to do exactly that. You can now change your main deploy branch from master. Oh, interesting. How do you do that? So again, a lot of services are moving from master to main. So what I'm going to do is exactly what's, oh, this is interesting. So I'm going to use the main branch from now on. So let's follow exactly these commands. So I'm going to do git checkout b main. This creates a new branch called main. And now I'm just going to do git branch capital D for delete master. And now the only branch that exists is main. Again, where people are moving away from calling the kind of, the central branch master and starting to call it main. So now all I'm going to do is deploy this application. So step one is Heroku login. You have to download the Heroku. I almost skipped this important step, but it says here, download and install the Heroku CLI. It's the command line interface for Heroku. Just do what it says so that you get Heroku in your command line. And you'll know you're ready if in your command line you can do which Heroku and Heroku exists. So then you do Heroku login. It'll take you to a web browser. You push login, and now I'm logged in. Back at the command line, it says, as you can see, I'm now logged in, which is pretty sweet. And then it's really straightforward. First thing we have to do is, because we've never pushed this Heroku before, we have to add a new Git remote called Heroku. So we'll do Heroku git remote, A for add, and then it's the name of the Heroku app that we put here, Electric Pancake. That adds a Git remote called Heroku, which means I can now do git push Heroku main, and that pushes our branch up to Heroku. And you can see it'll do a lot more than just accept the Git repository. It will also actually start up and run our app, which is pretty sweet. It says down here, build succeeded. So this means that in a second, it'll tell us the web address, yep, right here, electricpancake.herokuapp.com, where we can visit our webpage. And if we go to this webpage, you can see, look at that, it's serving up exactly the server as we described it. And this link, unlike localhost 3000, this link, electricpancake.herokuapp.com, is one that you can send to your friends, that anybody on the internet can view. So this is, so you can see git remote ls, git remote l. How do you list git remotes? Git remote Heroku. Okay, so there's one called Heroku. I was just going to point out that in our last class when we did git push origin main, we had a remote called origin that pointed to GitHub. Right now, this repository only exists on Heroku and on our local machine. We could also push it to GitHub as well, and it's not uncommon for your Git repository to exist on Heroku, to exist on GitHub. You can have multiple remotes. It's fine and very common. Just haven't pushed this one to Heroku yet. I'm sorry, to GitHub yet. But this is actually all you need to do to get your server running on Heroku. And now that we've done that, we can get on to the I guess this was the appetizer portion of the course, and now we can get on to, or the class rather, and now we can get on to the meat, which is making an application that uses React to render a client-side app. Okay, and we're back. So, main course, React. Here's what we are going to do. So we, to get this, to get React working, we have to do a little bit more than just creating a repository and checking out React. There's a little bit more setup than that. we're going to be making use of a template that I have made called React Express Starter. So if you go to this URL, github.com/starackhadge/React Express Starter, you can find this template that we're going to be using to get started with a React project. So we're going to be making use of templates a lot in this course, actually. So it's a good, I guess, to get in the habit of, or to practice this workflow. So the way to use a template is similar to using any project on GitHub. Go to the URL, and then here where you see use this template, just click this, and it will clone for you a new repository starting from that template. It's very similar to forking. So what I'm going to do here is change the name of this repository to, let's call it React Intro. Rect Intro? No, how about React Intro? That's available, nice. And then I'll just create a repository from this template. This creates a new repository. So in a second, when your repository has finished being created, you should see something like this, and you can get your code. So when you click this, you'll see some options here, getting it via HTTPS, SSH, or the GitHub CLI. I've never used the GitHub CLI. It might be sick, and feel free to try it. GitHub Desktop is an option too. The one option that you probably don't want to go with is downloading the files as a zip, because then it won't be a Git repository that you can actually commit to, and it won't have a Git history that you can work with. So it's between HTTPS and SSH are the options that I use most frequently. SSH, you have to do a little bit of configuration to set up GitHub to, basically you have to put your public SSH key on GitHub. That's something that's very well documented online. And if you use GitHub a lot, it'll really speed up your workflow. In fact, if you've used GitHub in the past, it's something you may have done already. And so SSH is kind of the nicest option if you've already set up GitHub. You can also use HTTPS. It's fine. It just means that when you actually do something like try to push your code up to GitHub, you will have to supply your password. But that's basically it. I'm going to use SSH. You can also use HTTPS. It's totally fine. Click this clipboard to copy it, and then I'm just going to go to my directory. So I'm back in my PIP directory, and I'm just going to do git clone and then paste the name of this GitHub or this GitHub link, and it will clone into a new folder, in this case called React Intro. And if I do cd react intro, and code dot, now I can look at the code in this repository. So I'm going to close. We don't need this old repo anymore, or this old, I guess it is a repo, this old Heroku repo anymore. I'm going to close it. We can take a quick look at some of the files in here. So some of the stuff should be very familiar. We've got a server here. This is just a normal Express server that's got a little bit of stuff set up. Don't need to worry about this. This is some special thing that lets us run the server in a development environment. More on that in a second. But the rest of the stuff should look very familiar. Express, app, port in a way that's going to work with Heroku. We set up a route and start the thing listening. Should all look very familiar. There's also some other stuff here, a proc file, which should look very familiar to you. And then there's this in app. We actually have the application itself. We'll look through that in a second. The important and new stuff here is probably the Webpack files down here. So Webpack. Webpack is doing two very important things for us in the context of this project. And it will kind of all become clear as we work with this a little bit what those things are. So the first is just something called bundling. We are making a client-side application. What that means is that when someone visits our page, we basically send them a whole bunch of JavaScript that defines what we want that application to do. If you think about a website like Twitter or Facebook or another website that has a large dynamic component to it, the JavaScript bundle is what defines the behavior of that page. The fact that when you click a button that makes a post and that post should send something up to a server and also change the way the page is rendered. When you click a like button, it increments a like counter. All that logic is part of the bundle. Also, how the page is rendered often is part of that bundle. The thing is that in order for the page to load quickly, typically you want one JavaScript file as opposed to a whole bunch of JavaScript files. Of course, when we make an application, we use the require mechanism to have one file depend on what's in another file. We'll talk more about require in a second, but you've seen it in Server, for example, this thing where we have require express. This file doesn't have all of Express in it. It requires Express, and usually Node does the job of managing that dependency. In a web page, we don't have Node. So what Webpack does is build a bundle where all this stuff is literally in just one file to get around this, the fact that in the browser we don't have this require mechanism. There's a lot of reading you can do on the subject, a lot of very smart people, but that's kind of in a nutshell what bundling is and why we need what Webpack is doing for us and why it's desirable when we're trying to deliver a client app. Because we want to develop the application by following good coding practices, having a bunch of separate files and using require to manage the dependencies between those files. But then we want to deliver just one file that people can run in their browser. The other thing that Webpack will do for us is Webpack has this notion of loaders. So when you load a file, in addition to sticking it in the bundle, Webpack can also do something to it, transform it in some way, prepare it for use. And in particular, we're using a loader for something called JSX, which is the language of React. So when we load this when we write files, we're going to write them using JSX. And more about JSX in a second, but the point is it's not vanilla JavaScript. The browser can't run it out of the box. Webpack uses another service called Babel to transpile, which is a portmanteau of translate and compile that JSX into JavaScript. All you need to remember is that we can use JSX in these client applications because we've configured Webpack in a certain way. That's all you need to know about Webpack. We actually aren't going to talk about how to configure Webpack at all in this class. We're just going to use these templates, but it is something that you can educate yourself about and that is useful to know if you so choose. But the meat here, the thing we really want to talk about is React, so that's what we're going to focus on. But let's actually run this and see what it does. Before you hop over to your iTerm and just start typing npm run server, we can take a look at the package.json and find this section that we haven't seen before necessarily called scripts. These are things that you can, you can run these scripts. So like, for example, this one here called build, and you can run these by doing something like npm run build. So this is using npm to actually run this script, and all npm is going to do is run literally what you've put here. And you notice that it says Webpack not found, and if we tried to run the server, we'd probably see Express not found. It's because after checking out this repository, remember I mentioned that you always git ignore node modules. So you see it says right here, here you go. Local package.json exists, node modules missing. Did you mean to install? Yes, I forgot to do that. So you just do npm install. And that will hydrate the application, so to speak, by looking at what's in package.json and installing all the dependencies into node modules. And if you look in node modules now, you'll see Express, you'll see Webpack. So one more time, it's doing some, interesting, it's doing some local, Okay, so let's do npm build. Build call with no arguments, right? Because I meant to do npm run build. And this will run Webpack to generate a bundle. You can see, and if you look in public, here it is, bundle.js. And this is what it looks like when all those JavaScript files are taped together, one big minified file. We can also do npm. If you look back in package.json, you'll see watch here. And this npm run watch will run our application in development mode, which is really nice. So you see here, app is sitting on port 3000, so I can go localhost 3000, and here's the application. Here's the React application. The kind of fun thing when you run in this development mode is that you can change things. You don't have to restart the server. You can change things in the client app, and you won't have to restart the server. So I could come into one of these components, for example, and I don't know, change the word, change where it says it is to, I don't know, it is now, or better would be to change the right now the default language is French. I'm just going to change this to English and save, and then without even reloading the page, or actually I have to reload the page, but now it says, it is, and tells you the time. And I didn't have to restart the server. Okay, so that's what is in the application to begin with. So there's some components here, this root component and this clock face component. This is all stuff that I've put in the repo to help you get started when you check out this template. For this class and for now, we're going to go our own way. And so the first thing we're going to do is just delete this components folder and everything in it. And in app.jsx, we're just going to delete the whole stupid thing. So let's get started writing our React application. So what we're doing right now is defining the entry point for React, essentially. If you look in index.html, you'll see a line here where it loads our bundle. If you happen to look into the Webpack file, you would see that we've defined the entry point to be app.jsx. So right now, we're defining when the web page loads our JavaScript and runs it, this is where it starts. So whatever we do here is the first thing that's going to happen. The first thing that we're going to do is to require both React and React DOM. So const React equals require React, and const React DOM equals require React DOM. So what is React anyway? We've said React a lot of times. React is one of a few related technologies similar to Vue.js and others like it that lets you make web pages that have dynamic content. The specific thing that it does that's really helpful, so you can imagine you had a web page where you click a button. Every time you click that button, it increments some counter. It makes some number go up on the page. And you might do something where you click the button, and then after you click that button, you make some variable get bigger, and then you find the component on the page, the document element that's actually showing that value, a paragraph element or a header element or whatever, and you change what's in that header element. What React does is it kind of abstracts all that away from you. So instead of when you change something, when you change, for example, a value, and you have some elements in your page that depend on that value, some elements in your page that should look different when that value changes, you don't have to go and update those elements by hand. React will do that for you because you've declared somewhere else that page element depends on that variable. That, in a nutshell, is what React is doing for you. The React DOM, we only need this in the kind of root page. React DOM is just a specific renderer for React that renders it into a web page as opposed to rendering it into something else. So all we do is define an entry point for React DOM by doing React DOM.render, and then we pass two things to render. The first is the element we want to render. I'm just going to write some JSX here, h1. Hi there. And then the second thing we want to do is render where we want to render it. In this case, document.get element by ID, and then the name of the element into which we want to render. In this case, it's just called main. And I know that because in index.html, there's a div with an ID called main, and you can see this is where the app is actually going to go. Okay, this is it. So this right here, this H1 business, this is the JSX portion of this app. It looks a lot like HTML, and that's by design. It's not actually HTML though. If I save this and then run yarn npm run build, and then take a look at the bundle that gets generated, I'm just going to search for, you can see right here this hi there, the string that's actually going to be rendered inside that header element, and you can see this r.createElement h1 null. So that angle bracket h1 JSX tag got transformed into a React element, and that React element will render as an h1 node in the actual HTML page, in the web page that you actually see. But there is a difference between h1 written like this in a JSX file and h1 written in an HTML file like this. h1 written in an HTML file like this is literally just an h1 tag. In the context of React, it is a React element that will render as an h1 tag. Again, it's not vanilla JavaScript, and that's why part of what Webpack does is transpile, turn this into just regular old JavaScript that the browser can run. Okay, so with that all out of the way, we're ready to actually get into making React and making a page that will do something. So let's start by just making a page that will give you a new name. It's a witness protection program page or something. You visit this page, you get a new random identity. We can accomplish that by using the chance library that we used last class. So let's go back to our terminal here and just do npm install chance. And this will pull in the chance module. And back in the page, I'll do const chance equals require. My equals key is all messed up. Equals require chance. And then const my chance equals new chance. Okay. And now how do we actually render a name into the page? Well, first let's get the name. So we'll do const new name equals my chance dot first, get a new random first name. So new name will be some random first name. How do we actually put it into the React page? Well, all I'm going to do is here where it says hi there, I'm going to do hi there, and then curly braces, new name. So this is going to, between these curly braces, it's going to, so if we just did it like this, if we just did hi there, and then new name with no curly braces, when I render this page, so let's do npm run watch to run this in development mode, and then let's go to localhost 3000. You see it just says hi there, new name. So it's rendering new name literally just by rendering the string new name. If you put it in curly braces like this, it tells React that you actually want to evaluate whatever is between those curly braces as JavaScript and then plug the result back in. So if I reload the page now, hi there, Harriet, a random first name. I can keep reloading. Lily, Bradley, Effie, Gerald, Jerome, Julian, etc., etc., etc. Random first names. So this seems to basically be working. So what I'd like to do now is, when I say that this is getting a little bit complicated, I mean, I guess you could argue it doesn't look that complicated, but in terms of sort of like what this is doing, there's this notion when it comes to software design or good programming or whatever, separation of concerns. And the idea is that you don't want one file to be doing everything. It's helpful for people who read the code to look at code and have every file kind of doing one thing. It makes it easier to figure out what's going on. So I'm going to take all this name generation stuff and move it to a new file. In app, I'm going to click new folder and make a new folder called util. And in util, I'm going to make a new file called namer.js. And it's just .js and not .jsx because all I'm going to do is change, there's only going to be JavaScript in this and no JSX. In namer.js, I'm going to export two functions for generating a random first name and a random last name. So it's going to be pretty much what you'd expect, just const chance equals require chance, const my chance equals new chance, and then two functions. So because I want to export these functions, I'm going to use a mechanism called module.exports. Similar to the way that a node script has access to this global object called process, and process contains this property env that contains all the environment variables. There's also this global object called module. And module.exports are the things that this particular module will be exported. So anything that requires this file will have access to whatever you put into module.exports. So if we do module.exports.first equals, and then I'll use big arrow function notation here. So just open braces or open parentheses, big arrow braces, and then I can just do return my chance.first. I've exported a function here that just returns a new random first name. So this is, I'm setting the property first on the module.exports object to be this anonymous function, anonymous because it has no name, but a function that just returns a new random first name. And I'll do the same thing down here. I'll do module.exports.last equals, and then a new random last name. Nice. And now this file has exported those two functions. If I want to use those two functions back in this file, I can do something like this. I can do const, I guess I'll do it like this, const namer equals require dot slash util slash namer. Two important things to point out here. One, when you're requiring a module that you've installed using npm install, you don't have to specify, in fact, you shouldn't specify the full path, which would be something like dot dot slash node modules, React, whatever. You just give the name of the module and leave it up to Node to resolve the path. If you're requiring a local file, a file that you've written, you do use a relative path. Dot slash means go relative to the current directory, find a folder named util, in that find a file named namer. Last thing to notice is that you can leave off the .js extension when you require a JavaScript file. Okay, so here, instead of doing this business, we can just do const first equals namer dot first, const last equals namer dot last. And we know we have a function called first and a function called last in this required namer object because we set module.exports to be first and module.exports.last to be this function. So that's how you use require and module.exports to pass functions between files. So now let's just change this to use the new first and last name. I'll do hi there first and then last. And if I reload the page, it's giving us a new random name. Hi there, Christine Fantecchi. Hi there, Howard Tucker, Carolyn Reedy, Norman Okada, Cynthia Charlton, Thomas Van Gelderen. These are some names, man. Okay, now, so far, all we've done is render a static page. It's time to get to the good stuff. It's time to render some content that actually changes. Before we can do that, though, we need to create our own React component. We've got these here, these h1 tags, and this is a built-in React component. If we want to make a component that has some state that hooks into React and that therefore can be dynamic, we need to declare our own component. In React, one very easy way to declare a component is just to create a function that itself returns some JSX. So what that looks like is we can do something like const root component equals, and then all we need to do is make a function where that function, oh, my Bluetooth turned off. Some components that returns some JSX. So I'm just going to take everything in here, cut that out, and paste it in here. So we've made a component now that just returns this. And when we render our component, I can just do render root component. And by declaring a function like this that returns JSX, we've defined a new React component. You know, h1 is a built-in component, and now root component is a component that we've defined. This syntax here, where you have an opening tag that closes itself, is because root component has no children. We could also do this. It's exactly equivalent, but it's maybe a bit clearer to just do something like this, because this component, again, has no children, so it just closes itself. Okay, so there's our new component. We had to do this because this is the way to make a component that has some state. Now, how do we make a component that has state? What do I mean by having state? Well, essentially, React components have, in order to make a component that's dynamic, you have to put, you have to tell React where how your component, what your component depends on. You have to say to React, my component needs this thing to render, so whenever this thing changes, please re-render my component. There are a few different ways to hook into that. One of them is with component local state. To declare some component local state, you use a React function called useState. So first I'm going to include that function. I'm going to do that up here by pulling the useState function out of the React module. So I'm going to do const useState equals react.useState. There's other ways to do this. You could also do, if you just type use state into VS Code and push enter, it'll do an import for you like this. This is doing the exact same thing. This is a syntactic shorthand for getting the whole object out of require.react and then assigning the useState property to a new variable called useState. Look up something called destructuring, object destructuring in JavaScript for a bit more about how to do that. For now, I will just do const useState equals equals react.use, not use callback, use states, like this. Okay, so what does useState do? Well, it returns two important objects, the state itself and the function that we can use to update that state. So I'm going to do this, const square bracket first, set first, equals use state first. So what on earth is this doing? This is the useState function returns an array. The first element of the array is the actual bit of state that we have declared in, oh, you know what? We shouldn't be doing it like this because I've used the variable name first twice. So instead of first here, let's change this to use, to namer.first, like this. So what is this doing? This is, and we can delete this line as well. So like I was saying, useState returns two things. You call useState to put a new variable essentially into React's world, and React will return to you the value of that variable. It will also return to you a function that you can use to update that variable in React's world. This syntax here, where you declare two variables at once using square brackets, is something called array destructuring. Essentially, useState is giving us back an array, and then we're assigning two variables right away. One is being set to the first element of the array. The other is being set to the second element. This is exactly equivalent to doing something like this, state equals useState, and then const first equals state.first, and const set first equals state Sorry, I got this wrong. It's the same as saying const first equals state of 0 and const set first equals state of 1. So this is exactly equivalent to doing it like this, first and set first. This first way of writing it using square brackets and array destructuring is much more common, and will be what you will see if you look up this kind of thing online. So I'm going to use this syntax. So this already has created a variable named first in the local state on this object. And that gives us what we need to create dynamically a new first name for this object. So what I'm going to do in our component is not only return this little greeting, but also return a button that we can use to get a new first name. Let's start by just making that button. So I'm going to do return, and then I'm going to put parentheses here just to group together these two components. So I'll return this h1 component and then also a button that says refresh first name. And you can see that VS Code is already underlining this with red, and it's probably not going to work, but just for fun, let's look at what the page says when we try to render this. So I'll reload. I'll reload. It's blank because there's an error, and if I open up the JavaScript console, over here you can see it says module build failed, line 14, adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. And it's also telling us here in code, in VS Code, that the JSX expressions must have one parent element. So basically, a component can't return two adjacent JSX components. If you want to return two components, they have to be wrapped in a parent component. So we could wrap these in a div like this. And now the complaint goes away. And if we go back to the page and reload it, you can see there's a button here that says refresh first name. The button doesn't do anything yet, but it's there. How do we make it actually do something? The first thing we have to do is make the button give the button a function to run when we press the button. So let's do that right now. Let's do const refresh first equals, and then for now, let's just do console.log button pressed. Cool, save, go back to the page, reload, open up the JavaScript console, which is, I just did the keyboard shortcut for it, by the way, but it's under View, Developer, Developer Tools, or JavaScript console, either one. If I push refresh first name, oh, I didn't actually hook it up. So sorry, so that's the function. If I want the button to run that function when I click it, I go into button, and here between the right angle bracket, I do on click equals, and then in curly braces, the name of the function, refresh. And I wrote clease instead of click, so let's fix that. And this sets the on-click property, more on props in a second, of the button to be that function, refresh first. Now, if I reload this page and start to hit the button, you can see it's printing button pressed down here in our JavaScript console. We don't want it to log button pressed, though. We want it to actually update the value of this function. I'm sorry, update the value of the button. So to do that, we have to call this setFirst function. So we actually can't have this, I shouldn't have put this function out here outside of the refreshed first, outside of the root component, because this function depends on, or it needs setFirst. So really, you should put it down here. And then what this function is going to do, instead of calling console.log button pressed, it's just going to call setFirst and grab a new random name. So namer.first. And that's it. So you hit this button. The button is going to call setFirst, which is a special function that React gave back to us after we called React useState to update the first variable in React's world. We're giving it a new random first name. Namer.first is a function that we pulled in from our own namer file. And when we hit that button, it's going to update this first variable. Because we used useState to put that state into React's world, React will see that this component needs to be rendered again, and it will re-render the component with a new value for first. So if all goes to plan, we should be able to reload this page, and every time I push refresh first name, look at that, we get a new first name. Cecilia Pieraccioni, Cecilia Pieraccioni, Jesse Pieraccioni. These are good names. So that's how you use useState to create some dynamic content on your page. We could make another button to change the last name. It's probably good habit, or rather good practice. So let's do the same exact thing for the last name. So I'm going to get rid of this last variable here, and instead use useState to create last in React's world. I'll do const last set last equals useState namer.last, because it's a last name, not a first name. And then I need a function to refresh the last name. So const refresh last set last namer.last. And then another button for that. So we'll make another button here. Instead of calling refresh first, it will call refresh last and refresh the last name. Save, reload. And now we've got these two buttons. We can refresh our last name, and once we find a last name we like our first name we like Alejandro, we can start to roll through some last names. Alejandro Fleming, sure, why not? Great name. Beautiful. So we've seen how to use useState to update the state of a button. Update the state of a React component. There's one other big mechanism for making dynamic React components that absolutely we need to cover. In addition to state, there's also something called props. In general, state is something that the component has local to itself, whereas props are something that are passed down from a parent component into that component. So let's see how to use props. We've already actually kind of seen it. This on-click thing here is a prop of the button component. We can also make our own custom component that uses props. So let's make a new component. Let's take this hi there, whatever component and make it into and recreate that as a custom component. So I'm going to come into app and make a new folder and call this folder components, and then make a new component called greeting. And it has the JSX extension, not the JS extension, because it's going to have some React elements in it. So because it has React elements in it, the first thing we need to do is do const React equals require React. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign module.exports to our component. So we'll do module.exports equals and then a function that will be our component. Excuse me. So all I'm going to do now is come back into JSX, take this component right here, this header component, cut it out, and paste it here. Hi there, first, last. And then I want to use this greeting component in app.jsx. So the first thing we do is require it, const greeting equals require /components/greeting. Now, a small but important thing to point out is that this, in Namer, we didn't overwrite the module.exports object. Instead, we created a property first and a property last on module.exports and assigned each one of those properties to a function. In greeting, we're replacing the entire module.exports object with our function for rendering this greeting component. There The important difference is that when we actually want to use, when we require greeting here, greeting is an object, as a function rather, and namer is an object. So greeting is a function, namer is an object. In general, you can use module.exports however you want to pass things around between JavaScript files. But if you're only exporting one thing, and especially if that one thing is a class or a function, it's very common to replace the module.exports object with your object. Right, so if it's only one thing, it's kind of common to replace it. If you're exporting a library of functions, it's much more common to have a module that exports object with a bunch of properties, each property of which is one of your functions. So two different conventions. You can use whichever one makes more sense in your application. So greeting here, all we need to do to use it is just do greeting, and then similar to the root component, the greeting closes itself. Now, a great question is, we set first and last here in our root component, and we'd like to use those in greeting to render them, but we haven't actually set this up, or rather, how do we pass those values down to greeting? Well, in order to pass them down to greeting, we pass them down as properties. So we can do something as simple as first equals, and then embraces first, last equals, and then embraces last. So it's as simple as this. So now we're passing down first, or first. We're passing down the first variable as a property named first, and the last variable as a property named last. In greeting, we can use those because React will pass to this function the props that we used to, or any props that we pass down to it in an object called props. So now here, instead of rendering a variable called first, we render props.first, and instead of last, we render props.last. And now if we reload this page, it should look, it doesn't work. I mean, of course it doesn't work. I could have told you it wouldn't work. It says first is not defined. Fair enough. Oh, it's because I forgot to save this. But if I save it and then go back to Chrome and reload, now you can see the page is working as before, except this whole header here, instead of being rendered directly in root components, it's being rendered in our greeting component. So now we can do something like, maybe we want to implement our page both in English and in French. So let's make a button that toggles between those two languages. So I'll do const lang set lang equals use state, and then the first thing that you pass, I actually don't think I mentioned that the first thing you pass, the thing that you pass to the use state function is an initial value for the variable that you're declaring in the React state for this component. So in this case, I'm going to make it default to being in English. No, you know what? Let's make it default to being in French. You know, let's reject the English hegemony and substitute the French hegemony. Feel free to, you know, whichever hegemonic culture you want to insert your own hegemonic culture here. And now we can make a function to switch between languages. So we'll just do const switch lang equals, and then declare a function to switch languages. Basically, it'll be what you expect. It'll be if lang equals English, then set lang French. Remember, we can't do, if we just did something like this, lang equals fr, this won't work. This will just reassign this lang variable to be fr. We have to call setLang in order to not just change the value of our local variable, but to also change it in the React state of this component. Otherwise, we're not hooking into React's kind of life cycle mechanism, and React won't know that it needs to re-render our component. So rather than assigning like this, we do setLang fr. And then, of course, else we just do setLang English. And you could do whatever you want here to cycle between languages or whatever. But now that we have established a way to switch languages, let's make a button to switch between languages. We could just have a button that says toggle language. It might be more fun to have a button that says switch to French or switch to English. So to do that, we can render the button differently depending on which language we have. It's probably easiest to do that if we just declare a local, but if we make a variable here for the button. So we'll do const lang button. And this is something you're absolutely allowed to do, is just have a little bit of JSX here. You know what, let's do it like this. Let lang button if lang equals English, then we can do lang button equals button on click equals switch lang, and what the button text will be switch to French, because if we're in English, then the button will switch to French. And if the language is not English, oh my God, where's the semicolon? Else, then the lang button will be switch to English. And then let's just render the button down here. So braces, lang button. Cool. So we've created this lang button local component, JSX component, and then we're rendering it here next to our other components. If we reload the page, there's our button. And as we click the button, it switches between English and French. And it's not actually changing the language here though, because we haven't implemented that yet, but we at least have a button that toggles languages. And now what we can do is actually use this language in our greeting. Let's pass it down as another prop. So we'll just do lang equals lang. And then to actually use this property in our greeting, we come into greeting and we can render the component differently depending on the prop. So what we'll do, there's a few ways to do this, of course, but why don't we do something like this? We'll do const, why don't we do it like this? We do if props.lang equals, this is a bad way to do it. Let's do it like this. Let's prefix or something. If props.lang equals English, then we do prefix equals hi there. Else prefix equals bonjour. And then down here, instead of hi there, we'll do prefix. Don't think this is how I did it in my notes. It's not how I did it in my notes, but I think this is actually better. So it says there are errors. Why are there errors? Why are there errors? Div has no corresponding closing tag. Why? Why do you say that? No. Oh, it's because I deleted the closing, the missing slash here on the greeting tag. Okay, so I'm going to save this, come back to the page, reload. Look, it's defaulted to French, and we can switch to English and toggle back and forth between French and English, and also roll some new names. Interesting, it happened to give, it seems to be giving a lot of French names here all of a sudden. LaCroix? Discuss. So this is all of the React that I wanted to show you in this class. And now you're ready for the homework. What is the homework? Well, the homework is to implement, tic-tac-toe using React and then to deploy it to Heroku. So what does tic-tac-toe look like? Tic-tac-toe looks like a 3x3 grid. You can click in one square and it either puts an X or an O in that square. So you'll obviously need to figure out some way to store whose turn it is, and then either put in an X or put in an O, depending on who clicked there. You have to detect when somebody has won. The key to this, the hard part of this, is that you need to, the squares need to, it's the squares that you actually click on to put an X or an O in that square, but you need, at a higher level, you somehow need to determine when somebody has won. And so the way that you typically do that is you have a function. So here, for example, we have this refresh first and refresh last function, and we're passing those down to the button. So when the button gets clicked, it actually calls this function back up here to do something. And this is like the key thing that you need to wrap your head around in order to implement tic-tac-toe. You have to pass a function down to your individual buttons, and those buttons will call back up into their parent component to trigger the adding of an X or an O, and then ultimately to determine if somebody won. Another key to it is that when your button or when your custom component calls back into its parent, it can call back into the parent with a little bit of identifying information. So for example, if we just had a function like this, so const say hi, right? Const say hi equals function, and that function has an argument name. We can do console.log. Hi, my name is name. So this is a function that takes an argument name. If we wanted to call this function from a button, we could do something like this, right? Button, and then on click. On click could itself be a function that calls this function. So we could write something like on click and then create a new function that is just, all that function does is call say hi, but it calls it with the argument Bob, right? Actually, and this is Bob the button. And we can make another button that calls say hi with an argument Carl. And the name of that button here is Carl. So this is, we're creating each button calls a different function. One of them calls an anonymous function that calls the function say hi with the name Bob. The other is an anonymous function that calls the function calls the function say hi with the name Carl. And this is the key, right? Is that like you've given these buttons both call back up into the parent, but they call back in with a different argument. So this is kind of the core thing you need to implement tic-tac-toe. I'll show you what this looks like too. It'll look like what you expect. If I come back to this page and reload, there'll be two more buttons, one Bob and Carl. And when I click Bob, of course, it'll say, hi, my name is Bob. When you click Carl, it'll say, hi, my name is Carl. So that's been our class. That's the homework. Good luck. I'll see you next week for part 3. Hope this is useful for you, and take care. Have an amazing week.